Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to share God's word here and anywhere. So I hope God's words will ring true in our hearts this morning. Let me read our passage for us, which comes from Luke chapter 9, verses 23 to 27. So I believe it's going to go up there. And let me read it for us. And he said to all, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God." This is God's word. If you look at Luke as a whole, just the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, you can kind of see chapter 9 as a pivot point. It kind of is a turning point of the book itself. And up to chapter 9, you kind of have this feeling where Jesus is introducing himself and we're getting to know him. As you read through kind of like a novel, a book, you'll see that you're getting to know who Jesus is. A lot of us are familiar with who Jesus is, so it may not feel like that. But the book, as you read through, that's what happens. And at chapter 9, it takes a shift. We know who Jesus is. Now he starts to tell us about how we are to follow him, how we are to live in his footsteps. And we learn who Jesus is in the previous verses of this chapter, in verse 18 and 20 through 20 very clearly, where we hear Peter respond to Jesus' question of identity. And Peter says in his answer, "the Christ of God." In Matthew chapter 16, we see the same identifying story of Jesus. And there he expands it a little bit. Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And from that we know who Jesus is. And now he goes in a few verses after of the very same chapter and tells us what it means to follow this God-man. And let me begin our time with a bit of a story of a man who knew what it meant to be a disciple of Christ, to follow Christ. And there was a man who was born in Germany, and you may suspect as I tell this story who it is. He was born in 1906. He was the sixth of 8 children. It's a big family, and was the first in his family to become a theologian. He was actually a very intellectually gifted man. He finished his doctorate at the age of 21, before some of us even finish college. Something most people do nowadays, finishing their doctorate, is if they're good about it, it's in their early 30s. If you're really up to task, then maybe your late 20s. But this guy finished in his 21st year of life. So he was a very intellectually gifted man. He started teaching as a professor in his mid-20s in Berlin and had a great career ahead of him in all respects. But in 1939, something happened in the world. And a lot of you guys who are history buffs may know, this man entered into a very uncertain time in his life because World War II was imminent. It was about to happen. And knowing the Nazi regime and Hitler, he knew that he could never fight for his own country. Knowing his beliefs and knowing his country's regime, he knew they conflicted. So in this troubled time, he wrote to some of his friends in America, and he actually landed a job in New York. Where a school called Union Seminary in New York, and he was offered a teaching position there. So in June 1939, he left for America. And back then, they didn't really fly. It took a really long time. They took boats. So he got on a boat and he headed to America. So you can imagine he had a lot of time to think, even though a flight is also long. So he had a lot of time to think as he went to New York City for his new job away from his home country of Germany. But as he arrives in New York, he realizes that his choice of leaving Germany was wrong. Not just wrong in his head, but it was against his calling. That God was not calling him to New York, but that God was actually calling him to Germany. And he writes this to one of his dear friends as he lands in New York. I have come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I shall have no right to take part in the restoration of Christian life in Germany after the war unless I share in the trials of this time with my people. So the next month, July 1939, he returns to Germany. He actively resists the Nazi regime and even controversially participates in the assassination attempt of Hitler. He never survives the war. He was caught and he was executed right before the war ended in 1945 at the young age of 39. And this man, whose name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as you may have surmised already, he's forever known now to us in church as a disciple who followed Christ, even though it cost him a prestigious teaching career, a comfortable life away from war, and ultimately it cost him his life. He followed Christ regardless, even though there was a huge cost to that. In our passage today, we learn more directly from Jesus about the basics of Christian discipleship. And I think it's a little bit, perhaps you've heard of this topic very frequently, but I think it's very apt because the founder of this church as a whole, Church of Love, was very keen on the discipleship program and it has spread it throughout Korea. And I think it's very apt in that sense. But Jesus teaches us in this passage about what it means to follow Jesus, how we can grow in becoming a disciple of the one we call Savior and Lord. And we learn three simple things to begin about what discipleship is. And the first thing is that discipleship is not an option. It's not an option. In verse 23, the first verse that we read, Jesus addresses these statements to all. Not just his 12 disciples, not just to a specific group of people, but he says it to all. And this means that Christian discipleship is not a professional endeavor. It is not just a calling for mature Christians. It is a calling for all Christians. As Christ says, all. He addresses all. And in that sense, it's basic. It's very basic to our life in following Christ. And the second thing that we can learn is that discipleship is not the way to be saved. And I'm very thankful for Pastor Joe, in really emphasizing that even in the praise time. Discipleship is not a way to be saved. We are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, as Ephesians 2 very clearly teaches us. We follow Christ not to be saved, but because he has saved us. That small, simple principle is utterly, utterly important to Christianity and Christian discipleship. And the third thing that we understand about discipleship in this passage is that it's not a one-time thing. It's not when you just get saved or in the middle or near the end of your life that you participate in this endeavor, but it is an ongoing, daily, again and again activity. This is why Jesus instructs us to deny ourselves and pick up the cross daily. He says we have to do this daily. The word follow comes after these imperatives in the present tense. You are following along in the present as you are going throughout your life, past, present, and future. It is an ongoing, again and again activity. Being his disciple, being Christ's disciple, is not just a label or a title. We do often use it that way. But it is just a daily activity that we participate in. It is something that we describe as we grow in Christ, as we follow after him through his word and the power of the Holy Spirit. So then, what does it actually mean specifically to follow Jesus? Being a disciple of Jesus Christ means many things, but from our passage we begin by learning two things very overtly, very specifically, and they essentially go hand in hand, and you can think of them kind of interchangeable. And that is self-denial and bearing one's cross daily. Self-denial and bearing one's cross daily. And this is a very hard concept to imbibe, to make it our own. It's easy to understand in our minds, but it's very counter to our daily life in the modern times, because we live actually in a very self-indulgent age. And I'm not saying that necessarily in comparison to other times in history, but if you just take a look and examine the times that we live in a very self-indulgent age. And one example, and this is a small, perhaps comical example, and I don't want to indict anyone who participates in this very often, is the activity of selfies. How many people here have taken selfies in the recent week? You don't have to feel guilty. There we go. It's okay to take selfies. But I remember distinctly, it was a while ago, when selfies weren't really like a cultural thing. And I was hanging out with a high school friend of mine and another friend of his, and we sat down for coffee, and I didn't really know this other third person well, and that person started to take out their phone and start taking pictures, and I thought it was going to be about with us. You know, a group picture, okay, this is to commemorate. And then this person started to just take pictures of themselves. And this went on for about 10 minutes. And I was very, in my sinful judgmental self, I tried to stop perceiving it that way, but it was very odd. And I look back on that time and think about now. And actually, I don't think that's weird anymore. And I think that just kind of says a little bit about how used to we are in terms of being self-indulgent. Just a small marker of that. Another stronger marker, perhaps, is that we consider our feelings higher than truth in a lot of our cultural circumstances. And that doesn't... the church is not exempt from that. We sometimes say, I feel this way, I feel that way, and this has to be right. And it may be right that the way you feel is true, and it may be a reflection of what is going on. But if it goes counter to what God's word is saying, an actual objective truth going on outside, your feelings are not true. It is not ultimate. But our cultural sense now is that we are so self-indulgent. I am most important, that I determine what truth is. And it comes out in a way where we talk to each other is, I feel bad because of this, this, and this. This needs to change. And we lose sight of others and objective reality. We live in a very self-indulgent age. And we live in a society that exalts this self-actualization of our identity. It's not only self-indulgent, we want to self-actualize ourselves. We want to become someone in our identity. We live in a time where finding who you are is very, very important. And we do this as perhaps parents and even educators. You can be what you want to be. And I don't want to tell you to stop saying those things, but I want you to think upon how scriptural that is just in and of itself. We actually can't be whatever we want to be. I wanted to be a soccer player. I mean, I am thankful for where I am, but I did not become what I wanted to be. And it is our self-actualization culture. I am most important. What I want is what I need to achieve at all costs, even if I have to step on other people. That is the culture that we live in. In such an age, self-denial and bearing one's cross is very countercultural. We've heard this message before, and it sounds familiar so much so that we kind of let it pass. I know this, I understand, and I am living it. But actually, a lot of us, including myself, fail in this day to day. It is very countercultural, considering where we are in our time. And Jesus tells us to deny ourselves against the surrounding culture, to take up our cross. So what is denying oneself and taking up the cross look like? What does that look like? It is countercultural. What does that look like? 4 things that we can perhaps glean from our passage to understand taking up the cross and denying ourselves. If we are to follow Jesus, we deny ourselves and pick up the cross. He says those 2 things. What does that look like? First thing is to change, have our priorities change consistently. Once you become a Christian, your priorities change very drastically. But all your priorities has not changed. I can tell you that. Little by little, God, through His Word and the Holy Spirit, will convict you of your sin and help you kill that sin and turn back to Him in little ways daily. And part of that means your priorities, what you consider in your life as important, what it used to be before you met Christ and what it is now after you meet Christ, has to change drastically and consistently. There are still areas in your life that are not matching what God wills for your life. And He wants you to turn away from that sin and turn towards Him again and again and again. Apostle Paul, if we look at his life, we see that drastic change in his conversion. We love Apostle Paul as the great missionary in the New Testament, but he was a murderer, a Christian killer. He was actually, in some sense, no different from Hitler in that context. He wanted to wipe out the Christians. And he met Christ, and he changed 180. He said, I was completely wrong. And how he lives his life looks drastically different. That has to happen, but also as you live, little by little, more things, your priorities has to change. I did college ministry for about 7 years in Philadelphia, and in the beginning of that time, in my inexperience, I used to be very concerned with them getting drunk, doing, it's America, so, doing light drugs, and sleeping around. I was very concerned for their moral life. And I think that's very important, that, in the community of Christ, that you want to strive for holiness. But I realized there was actually a bigger sin just dwelling in a lot of my students' hearts that was going unseen. And that was their desire for comfort. A lot of the students who were very, in outward form, obedient. They obeyed all the 10 Commandments, perhaps not the first for in their hearts, but in terms of their outward appearance, they were pristine and holy. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't drink. They didn't sleep around, all those things. And yet, a lot of them, sadly, graduate, live their life, and they become ineffective Christians for the kingdom of God. Why? Because they just want to be comfortable. They just want to go to church every Sunday and consider themselves a good Christian. And they may be good in outward appearance, but their priorities hasn't changed. It's still about my comfort. Everything in my life, my job, my family, my circumstances, my friends has to be centered around how I will live my life so that I will be comfortable. And in that sense, our priorities need to change over and over again. For us, I want us to ask that question. Is my idol comfort? Is following Jesus just a concept in my mind? Do I try to get rid of all discomfort in my life? Is my idol comfort? The second thing that we learn about picking up our cross and denying ourselves is that we need to be prepared to face rejection, ridicule, and perhaps even death. Death might not be something very imminent for a lot of us, and hopefully it isn't. But we need to prepare, at least, to face rejection and ridicule. The cross was a sign of severe punishment and elimination. We think upon well of the cross now. It is something beautiful for us because it is through that we receive salvation in Christ's death and resurrection. And yet, at the time when Christ died on the cross, it was a dirty thing. It was a shameful thing. The disciples looking at Jesus on the cross, they wouldn't have just thought about he's dying. It would have been, he is dying in this shameful manner. How could this happen? And we have to be prepared for a life that might bring us shame. But the important thing here, again, I'm thankful for the praise time, is the stress that Christ makes on in verse 24, where he says, "For my sake." We have to be prepared to face rejection and ridicule for Christ's sake. It's not just being ridiculed and being rejected. There are instances where if you receive that, it may be unjust, that you need to change that. And there are times when it just means nothing. I remember living in Philadelphia when I first moved there in this very cheap housing. I was thankful for that, but because it was cheap, it was very cold. And I remember sleeping. I had about 7 roommates. We all had our own rooms. And the house temperature would go down to about, I know it in Fahrenheit, it was like 40 Fahrenheit, which is I think like 5 degrees Celsius. It wasn't freezing, which was, I'm glad for that, but I remember my mattress wouldn't go down. I would lay down to sleep and it wouldn't sink. And I was thinking in the beginning, like, oh, I'm going to seminary, I'm suffering for Jesus, and I'm facing this hard time. And I sat there, no, we should just pay for heating. Like, no one is benefiting from this. I do not understand. And I realized then, not all suffering is good. Because of this, Christ says, for my sake. You need to prepare yourself for ridicule and rejection, not just generally, but for my sake. And that's even harder. Do people know you for being a follower of Christ? Are you experiencing ridicule, rejection because of what he's done for you? The third thing that we learn is leaving behind one's dreams and following Jesus where he calls us. We are called to live lives of following after Jesus. And this is the point where we learn about how we are to seek in our specific lives, about how we are to turn our actual life direction for Christ's purposes. So in general, our priorities can change, but in large part, is your life in any sense for his kingdom cause? I want to encourage everyone here to be, if you have an immediate family, to be for your family. That should be a very top priority in your life. But it should not be your only priority. As you love upon your family, in that loving, you should also ask, is there any kingdom import? Am I living a life that is for Christ's kingdom? Am I following him in that way to advance his kingdom? And I speak about that generally because there will be very specific ways each person here will flesh that out in your lives. But I can also challenge you just as a collective. Is New Harvest, this community, living together as a community for kingdom cause? Does the person who lives across the street care that you are here in a positive way? Are they inquisitive about the gospel because of the fact that you come here to worship and you live the life that you live where you live? Is that person asking about the gospel, or do they just not care at all? It's just this huge building on this corner that becomes busy on a Sunday morning. Is that all it is? John 13:35 tells us that others will know Jesus by our love. How we love in this community and how we love upon outside. Is New Harvest doing that? And I want to challenge you in that sense. The fourth thing that we learn is learning to hope for the blessing of God's kingdom. And I think I keep mentioning the praise time, but I think it's because it connects so well, and I'm thankful for the songs that we sang. See, all this talk of self-denial and bearing one's cross, it may sound very dreary and masochistic. Oh, I just need to kill all my joy and become an unhappy person. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what our passage is saying. It's not a call to become masochistic, just in general. That's, again, that is that example of me sleeping in the cold for no one's benefit. That's not what this is talking about. Jesus here, when he tells the people that are listening about this instruction to follow him, he's doing the arithmetic of eternity. He's bringing an eternity into the calculation and telling them, this is easy math. Following me is the better way. If you don't consider eternity, yeah, that actually makes sense. If you live like this is all your life, it makes sense that you would live for yourself. But if you really believe upon the resurrection of Jesus Christ and believe his word saying that you will live forever with me in eternity, if that rings true in your hearts, the arithmetic of eternity brings the picture into a larger scope and says, following Christ is actually not just better, it's the more joyful way. What we experience now in following him, perhaps experiencing ridicule and rejection and discomfort, pales in comparison to what will be given in eternity. It's a daily struggle to really believe that. We hear it a lot, but to live our lives truly believing that is difficult. But through Christ and the Holy Spirit, we can believe and live out of that truth. I remember my history professor mentioning, it wasn't even related to the lecture that he was doing. He just started talking about himself and the resurrection of Jesus. And he says, sometimes every morning I find it very difficult to wake up. And this is a seminary professor talking. But a lot of those times, the thing that wakes me up, the one thing that gets me to stand up from my bed, is that Christ was raised from the dead. And what he was saying is that because he was raised, we are promised new life, not just here, but in eternity. And because of that, he can wake up against all the sadness, stuff going on in his life, and continue to follow after Christ. Living with gospel purpose has to be something that we learn if we are to say that we are following Jesus Christ. It may not be very clear in each moment of your life, but it is something that you seek out and ask in prayer, saying, Lord, where are you calling me? In what context? How can I live after your life, following you? Jim Elliot is a missionary. I'm sure many of you know him or heard about him. And he leaves this very famous phrase. He died in his 20s, being a missionary. And in that context, he was martyred. And he says this: he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. That is the arithmetic of eternity. If you really believe upon the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the eternity that he guarantees for us, it is foolish not to follow after Christ. So how can you actually do this, though? It's actually hard. It's very difficult to deny yourself and to pick up your cross. How can you become a disciple of Christ? It's not just understanding in your minds. You may have taken a lot of notes. Perhaps you don't take notes. But it's not just understanding what it is. I can list off every day for you what discipleship looks like. But self-denial is not just an intellectual thing. We have to want to do it. It is an issue of the heart. There is the mind that is involved. We have to understand. But it is an issue of the heart. You have to want to do it, which means you have to want to follow where Jesus is taking you. Luke 14:27 says, "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." And how do you do this becomes very hard often because we have a tendency to focus on the follow part. And you do definitely need to understand what it means to follow, what it looks like following. You do need to understand that. But how you are to follow actually is depends upon the me. If you are just so focused on how do I follow, then you will become exhausted. You will become dejected because you will fail. But he says, follow me. We have to look upon Christ and what he did for us every day. Then the follow becomes enabled. As you look at the me, as you look at Christ and what he did on the cross and what he did in the empty tomb, then the follow, as difficult as it is, becomes possible. You have to be captivated by the gospel of Jesus Christ. In chapter 22 of the Gospel of Luke, we find Jesus praying alone in the Garden of Gethsemane. And many of us know this account very well, where the disciples some of them followed him up into the garden, and they fell asleep as he is very fervently praying. And Jesus Christ, knowing full well the suffering and death that he has to experience soon, and to the suffering he has to endure on the cross, he says in that chapter, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me." Jesus Christ, the God-man, doesn't want to suffer. In that phrase, he says, "If you are willing, remove this cup from me." He knew the difficulty, he knew the cost, and then he says right after, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And in that phrase, you have to really remember that even in the beginning, he says, if you are willing, remove this cup, knowing full well that it would not be removed. And he says, not my will, but yours be done. And he does that for us. He does that to give us that eternity that we could bring into calculation. Before we knew Christ, we only had this life to live for. It only makes sense that if you're not a Christian, that you strive really hard to be for yourself. It actually only makes sense. But if you believe upon Jesus Christ, the death and resurrection of him, and the eternity that he bought for you, it only makes sense that you would slowly, daily pick up your cross, deny yourself, and want to follow him. Dietrich Bonhoeffer knew this very well. And when he decided to go back to Germany, he writes this: "When Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. It may be a death like that of the first disciples who had to leave home and work to follow him. Or it may be a death like Luther's, who had to leave the monastery and go out into the world. But it is the same death every time. Death in Jesus Christ, the death of the old man at his call." And Bonhoeffer is alluding to us having died with Christ and being raised with him. That is the equation that we are considering. That we have the enabling through the work of Jesus Christ's death and resurrection to follow. And daily, as we remember upon his work and who he is and what he did for us, being captivated by that, you will be enabled to endure the rejections, to endure the ridicules, and want to even be uncomfortable for the sake of his name. The other option for us, not following Jesus, actually is harder. It should be harder, and it should not make sense for us. I pray that for New Harvest, that this community becomes more and more enamored by the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that he becomes precious to you. That as you think upon how to follow, that you will still focus on the me. That you will treasure him each morning and get out from bed and not just live your schedule, but be willing to change your priorities, to change your desires, and to walk step by step along with him, following after him. Let me pray for us. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you First, that through your death and resurrection, that not only do you command us to follow Christ, but you enable us. That in your command, you give us your enabling through your grace. But Lord, we ask that at this time that we can reflect upon how we have lived and really pray and ask, seeking how you are calling us to change things big and small in our lives. Perhaps it is a habit, perhaps it is a large life direction. Perhaps it is how I engage in a particular relationship, but Lord, we ask that you help us through your grace to deny ourselves and to love one another as Christ loved us. We thank you once again for the gospel. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.